If you asked me before I moved to the Philippines whether you could retire here on $2,000 a month, I would have said yes, without hesitation. I spent months doing my homework, watching YouTube videos, reading blogs, comparing budgets, building spreadsheets. Almost every source seemed to agree on one thing. $2,000 a month was enough to live comfortably in the Philippines. So I built my entire retirement plan around that number. Then I actually moved here, and that's when I realized I'd been asking the wrong question. The money wasn't the surprise. Life was. Because retiring in the Philippines isn't just about whether $2,000 is enough. It's about whether you're prepared for everything that number can't tell you. This is the story I wish someone had shared with me before I made one of the biggest decisions of my life. The idea didn't come out of nowhere. For almost a year, I kept coming across stories of people who had packed up their lives, moved to the Philippines, and were living comfortably on far less than they had spent back home. Some were retirees, others were couples starting over. A few were living on even less than $2,000 a month. The more I watched, the more believable it became. Rent looked affordable. Fresh food was inexpensive. Even eating out seemed surprisingly reasonable. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. $2,000 looked more than enough. On paper, it all made sense. The more I added everything together, the more confident I became that I'd found the place where my retirement savings could finally stretch far enough to give me the life I'd always imagined. By the time I booked my flight, I wasn't feeling nervous about the money. I thought I had that part completely figured out. What I couldn't calculate was everything that never showed up on a spreadsheet. Landing in the Philippines felt like stepping into a completely different life. Everything was unfamiliar. The sounds, the weather, even a simple trip to the grocery store felt like an adventure. For the first few weeks, I caught myself comparing everything to America. Every price tag, every meal, every utility bill. I was constantly doing the math in my head. How much would this cost back home? At first, the numbers were encouraging. Almost everywhere I looked, my money seemed to go further than it had back home. It almost felt too good to be true. I remember thinking, maybe everyone was right. Maybe $2,000 really was more than enough. One morning, I walked down to a small neighborhood cafe and ordered a cup of coffee. The waitress smiled as she set my coffee on the table. She didn't know my name. I didn't know hers. But she smiled anyway. That might not sound unusual. Back home, most people were busy. Everyone had somewhere to be. Here, it felt like people took an extra moment to acknowledge one another. It was such a small thing, yet I found myself looking forward to that simple cup of coffee every morning. I sat there for almost an hour. No schedule, no meetings, no traffic to fight on the drive home. Just the sound of scooters passing by, people greeting one another, and a warm breeze moving through the open windows. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about work. I was simply enjoying the moment. But after the excitement of those first few weeks began to settle, I started noticing the things I hadn't planned for. Not because they were expensive, because they were impossible to predict before I arrived. Before I moved, I spent almost all of my time thinking about the financial side of retirement. I wanted to know exactly how much rent would cost, how much I'd spend on groceries, what utilities might look like, even how much I should budget for transportation each month. Those numbers mattered, but after living here, it slowly became clear that those weren't the numbers that determined whether I'd be happy. There were also expenses I hadn't really thought about. Setting up a home, replacing things I'd sold before moving, visa extensions, little purchases that don't seem like much on their own until they all arrive in the same month. The biggest adjustment wasn't learning how to spend less. It was learning how to live differently. Back home, my routine had been the same for years. I knew where I'd buy my groceries, which roads I'd take, where I'd stop for coffee. The faces around me were familiar. Those ordinary routines had quietly become part of my life. I didn't fully appreciate them until they were gone. Then I stepped onto a plane, and every familiar routine stayed behind. One afternoon, I walked into a grocery store planning to buy just a few things, something that would have taken 10 minutes back home. Instead, I found myself wandering the aisles, looking at products I'd never seen before. I probably walked past the same aisle 3 times before realizing I already had everything I came for. I couldn't find some of the brands I'd bought for years. The layout was different. The food was different. Even paying at the register felt unfamiliar. I remember walking back outside carrying one small grocery bag, thinking, this is going to take more time than I expected. Not because it was difficult, because everything was new. Some days, I found myself missing things I never expected to miss. Not because they were better, because they were familiar. So, was $2,000 a month enough? For me, yes, but probably not for the reasons you might expect. It wasn't because every month went exactly according to plan. Some months cost a little more, others cost a little less. Unexpected expenses still came along. That's simply part of moving halfway around the world. No matter how carefully you plan, there will always be something you didn't see coming. What mattered far more was learning the difference between needs and habits. Back in America, I'd spent years building a lifestyle around convenience, driving everywhere, buying the same brands, keeping the same routines. Without realizing it, I'd also become used to paying for those conveniences. As the months passed, I noticed something surprising. I wasn't checking my bank balance as often, not because I suddenly had more money, because money wasn't the first thing on my mind anymore. One evening, I was sitting outside watching the neighborhood wind down for the day. Children were still playing outside. Neighbors stopped to talk with one another. Someone waved as they walked past. It wasn't anything extraordinary. In fact, it was a completely ordinary evening. But somewhere in that moment, one evening, it hit me. I couldn't remember the last time I'd compared a price to America. I wasn't wondering whether I'd made the right decision anymore. I wasn't counting the days. I was simply living my life. That's when I realized, home isn't always the place you came from. Sometimes, it's the place where you finally stop thinking about leaving. And once I stopped comparing every purchase to what I used to have, something unexpected happened. The budget that once felt uncertain started feeling comfortable. Not because prices changed, because my expectations did. By then, I finally understood something I'd spent months trying to calculate. If someone asked me today whether they could retire in the Philippines on $2,000 a month, I'd tell them, it's possible. But don't let that number become the reason you move. And don't let it become the reason you decide not to. Your retirement won't be defined by a budget. It'll be shaped by the life you build after you arrive. Those things are worth far more than anything you'll ever put into a spreadsheet. Moving to the Philippines turned out to be one of the biggest decisions of my life. Not because it saved me money, because it changed the way I looked at retirement altogether. These days, I still enjoy my morning coffee. I still keep an eye on my budget. Some habits never disappear. But I no longer measure my retirement by the balance in my bank account. I measure it by something much simpler, whether I wake up looking forward to the day ahead. The question was never, can I retire in the Philippines on $2,000 a month? The real question was, can I build a life here that feels like home? For me, that's been worth far more than any number I ever wrote down in a spreadsheet. If you're thinking about making a similar move someday, I hope my story gave you something that no budget calculator ever could. A more realistic picture of what starting over actually feels like.